an hour here to run through SmartForms. James is under the cosh to get through quite a bit in this session. It's going to be a fairly heavy config session in a good way to get you up and running with SmartForms, tackle some really big use cases and challenges that you probably have. So yeah, we're really looking forward to it. James, I think there was just whilst we're waiting for people to come in, I know you're keeping an eye on what we're doing with AI and developments, and we're kind of using these webinars as a bit of a forum to bring our customers along with the AI journey that we're going through. Do you want to maybe talk to something you're excited about?
Oh yeah. And you can say that AI is like a super buzzword at the moment. Like every software company out there is doing something with AI. But one of my
Everything's
favorite
AI driven, right? As
everything,
well now.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's everywhere. That little sparkle logo that seems to have just been adopted as the generic AI indicator, you see it in every app now. Like I'll open up
Yeah.
Google Sheets and it'll pop up and be like, "Do you want to use AI to do something with this?" But my favorite AI update we're working on is just a new use case for something Gatekeeper already has. And actually, I might have to share my screen to sort of exemplify this, just to
Yeah.
talk
Yeah.
about.
Sure.
I sort of want to show the existing feature just so I can compare with what we're improving about it. So some of you seasoned gatekeepers might be aware we have a feature already in the system called AI Extract. It leverages Amazon Web Services Textract. So the scenario that this is needed for is, having data in Gatekeeper for your contract records is very, very valuable. I was just on a dashboard there that's to do with risks, but you might have dashboards to do with like upcoming renewals, expenditure, and so on, and you need that data. So this feature, Amazon Web Services Textract, allows you to take documents and have Gatekeeper make an attempt at creating data from those, like reading the documents, finding out, the contract type, its value, its dates, things like that. And I actually have one ready to go. This is, and just bear in mind, this is using our old version of the feature. So you can see what this will do is it'll highlight what it thinks are the internal entity, the vendor, the dates of the contract, and so on. And this works fine to a point, but our next version of this is what's got me really excited. So first off, the improvement is we're moving away from AWS Textract to GPT 4.0, the brand new OpenAI AI engine, which is going to make this just probably a little bit more accurate and quick and powerful. But
Super
also, what it will,
fast.
yeah, a lot faster. So we've seen
Scarily fast.
estimates from our product team, and it's whenever they've tested it or like shown us or walked through how it will work, it's a matter of seconds, unless it's one of those poorly scanned documents when the actual reading of the text it takes it a little bit longer. But the better at user experiences, it will be better at we're making the integration better at identifying where the AI has found its values. So here we have a bit of a color combination, but there'll be over on the right hand side, it will say this is the text we read and this is what we took from it, and you'll be able to like correct it if it's doing things differently. You'll be able to give it prompts or instructions for custom data. So in this current version of the feature, it only works with our core data model for contracts. But if you have lots of custom fields, you'll be able to configure those to say, this custom field, let's say payment terms, this is a date. We want you to look for contracts to see if they need to be paid within X date of receiving invoices and so on. And the AI tool will be able to find those. But to build on that, if you add custom fields in future, you will be able to backfill using this AI tool. So the idea is if you add some extra fields to your repository at some point in time, you have extra reporting and metrics you want from your contracts. That way that you've configured instructions and prompts for those custom fields, you'll be able to say, go back through all of my previous master documents that I've had added to Gatekeeper over my tenure of using it, and try and extract those values as well. So it won't only work for brand new contracts being created from scratch like this, it'll work to decorate your existing repository a lot better. And then there's the one that you're really excited about, Daniel, where we're integrating it in workflow request forms. So if a user comes to Gatekeeper wanting to request a contract get approved and negotiated and signed, if they're starting with a document that's been given to them by the vendor, they'll just be able to upload that to the request form. And again, after a little bit of processing time, Gatekeeper will pull out some of the basic values to basically help fill out the request form for that user. So it's going to be a really, really cool improvement on this existing feature using AI. That was my
Yeah.
quick summary of it there.
No, it's all good. I think it's really cool. Whilst we're just waiting for people to join, we're still getting people joining right now. Just to give you a bit of an insight as to like what we're doing behind the scenes. And actually, just on that note, one thing that James and I are currently looking for is if anyone's looking to integrate Gatekeeper with something else, maybe it's an ERP system, it's a ticketing system, something like Jira. Maybe you're looking to integrate your Gatekeeper data with something like Power BI or Tableau. Please let us know, and we will run a poll at the end of the session. You can email, respond to any emails that we send out to you on this, because we've got some cool stuff going with integrations. It's going to let you get loads of data out of Gatekeeper, and yeah, be super powerful. James, we've pretty much still got people coming in. Courtney has just said, yes, I want to integrate with Jira. And Jira is something that, just to let you know, Courtney, we've been probably for the last year just thinking about all of this. But we're like more so like Jira is coming up time and time again, multiple different use cases, whether it's request management or whether it's review management on things like InfoSec reviews, all sorts of really cool stuff. So yeah, we can follow up with you afterwards. James, just before we kick off, did you quickly want to run through something around tenant health checks? And then I will give a bit of an introduction into what we're doing here with SmartForms today.
Yeah, definitely. Because I'm aware there'll be some people on this call, on this webinar, sorry, who have a lot of knowledge of Gatekeeper and know how their tenant works and how everything ticks. But there might be some who are relatively new to both their Gatekeeper environment and also just Gatekeeper, what's available in the app, because lots of our customers indeed might have certain huge swathes of the functionality that is included in their plan, but they're just not making use of. And you and I, Daniel, did do a fairly comprehensive Success Hours webinar series last year, where we went through all the different use cases of data and workflows and so on. But I didn't want to have to say to everyone here, if you need that recap, go and watch Daniel and I going through Gatekeeper for 10 hours or so on. We do actually have a service to help alleviate that sort of second guessing yourself, like, am I using Gatekeeper to its fullest, called a tenant health check. So our CSMs, if you reach out to one of them on our customer success team, will be working with someone from professional services, and they can have a look at your tenant for you and give you that feedback. Like, are you getting the most? Is your system in the best state? Are you making the most of the feature available to you in accordance with the big 3 Gatekeeper pillars of opportunities to benefit and alleviate pain points in contract vendor management? So I just wanted to say that's definitely something that many of the people on this webinar should be aware, that we offer tenant health checks, because it's a good way to remove any of that doubt. Like, so you aren't leaving webinars being like, do I need that? Am I making use of what I've already got? Things like that.
Yeah, and it can help you, on the note of SmartForms, understand on that control pillar, which is like the second pillar, whether your workflows are set up in a good way where we can start using SmartForms. Because something to mention, SmartForms works really well when you use it with workflows. You can use it from your repository only. James is going to go through all of this, so maybe I'll just jump into this, James, and kind of cover what we're going to go over today. So we're going to go very quickly through some of these. So we're going to give a quick overview of SmartForms, the challenges it solves. We're going to go over some of the use cases, and James is going to go into detail, and we've got some use cases. We're going to build some stuff live here, so I'm not going to over egg that. We've got the end goal of SmartForms. We're going to go over configuring SmartForms and then adding SmartForms to a vendor workflow, and then also on the contract side, because something James and I talk about quite often. I'm a bit of a contract nerd, and I absolutely love SmartForms and I've always wanted to have SmartForms available for my contract reviews. Is it compliant with my playbooks and stuff like that? So we're going to show off some bits there. So for anyone who doesn't know, what are SmartForms? So SmartForms are customizable automated forms within Gatekeeper. So they're the forms that you typically use whenever you ask for information from someone. So it could be an internal colleague, it could be your vendor for due diligence. And what it enables you to do is to collect lots of data, score that data, and then visualize that data. So it's really cool, really powerful. And the whole purpose of it is that what we're trying to do is move you into a proactive stance when it comes to risk management, performance management, compliance management, and effectively take you away from spreadsheets and all that mess, all that noise that typically comes with it, and get you into one platform. Like, that's the aim of Gatekeeper. You can try and do all of your work just in the one platform. So that's absolutely what we want to enable, and that's what James and I are going to try and show you today. Now, in terms of use cases, the primary use case and like the most obvious one is all around due diligence, right? If I'm going to ask my vendor a series of questions, and this could be about anything in general, typically is like how you do stuff, what you have in place, what systems, what processes, what policies, we can ask that information. And typically, you'll probably be asking a lot of this information in Gatekeeper already, or you may be doing it outside of Gatekeeper via spreadsheet. What you can do now is still ask those questions via the forms that you've already built in Gatekeeper, but every time a vendor completes them in your workflow, you'll have each one of those scored. It's really awesome. And that will carry through into your repository. So due diligence, performance tracking, like very small use cases around like ESG assessments, so we can like chop up these wider due diligences, GDPR compliance, InfoSec, and then we mentioned on contract scoring with regards to like your compliance to like, oh, we need 10 specific clauses in our contracts. Do we have them on our third-party paper? So it's a really, really cool use case. And I am just going to pass over the mic to James, and James is actually going to talk a lot in this session. So I'm just giving him a bit of a break because he's going to do a lot of config in a moment, really help you get set up. If any of you if any of you want to set up SmartForms, more than happy for you to try and set it up as we go along. James may move a little bit too fast, so you may want to wait till you've got the recording, kind of pause it, come back to it. But James, I think we're going to run the first poll. Yeah. And this is just a bit of a different question we're trying with you. Like, you know that we typically ask questions at the start of every webinar to understand, how you use Gatekeeper. This one's a little bit different. It's actually, if Gatekeeper could do anything for you right now, just like blue sky thinking, that really corporate jargon phrase that I kind of hate but works really well, what would it look like? You don't have to write loads. You can write as much as you want. This is really useful, and it's actually going to let us think about how we better improve the product for you. So James, whilst anyone is doing that, we're going to kind of go over the end goal of SmartForms now, and then you're going to jump into some demo and config.
Yeah, I think I also want to caveat one of the things you said, and it should hopefully become self-evident by the end of this webinar. If it doesn't, then I haven't described it well enough as a feature and how it fits together. But the best way to use SmartForms for structured and reliable data, so that you know it's being completed, it's being reviewed on appropriate schedules, is via workflows. And that's absolutely the pairing that we recommend you use the feature. However, I'm aware that from the signups, we have quite a few data analysts and BAs on this call. On this webinar, sorry. So there might be some of you that are interested in what happens to the data in SmartForms if it comes from other places than a workflow, such as via integrations being pushed into Gatekeeper from other places, maybe like Jira, like some people have talked about, some people asked about as soon as you mentioned integrations, Daniel. And SmartForms can score data that comes from anywhere. So if you do have integrations that push some data into Gatekeeper as well as collect some of it via workflows, or you have some sort of manual stuff going on in your repository as well, SmartForms work the same in all these places. But that said, hopefully by the end you'll be sold on my ethos that the workflows are the most effective way to set them up and just have them there so that they're always running and they're reliable. Thanks for that clarification as well. Yeah, I am in the chat there, Daniel. I am super hot, so I apologize if I look really sweaty. It's boiling in the UK
I'm
right
with
now.
you on that.
Okay, so let me share my screen and we'll talk about what they will look like once they're up and running. So I'll go back to that Gatekeeper tenant we were on just before, where I was showing AI extract. So, and I'll just open up a vendor just to show you what they would look like once you've had a vendor completing these SmartForms for a while. So in a vendor record, there we go. In a vendor record, when you first click in, you'll land on a data tab, and generally that'll be reserved for basic summary information about them, like how much are you spending with them on contracts, how many contracts do you have, basic information about their organization. But if you are using Gatekeeper a bit more thoroughly, you'll have extra information, like extra custom sections that you've added because you want to capture more than the default 10 or 20 fields that we put in every tenant's data model. However, as that starts getting bigger and bigger and you have sections of that data that all fits a common goal, what you might want to do is move it over to a custom tab. So a tab up at the top here that's just not part of the standard data view like this one. It's its own section. And not only can you move fields over there, what you can do is you can have them, and you can see I've got a few different examples here, InfoSec, general compliance and also performance. What you can do is once you move those custom fields over there, you can assign scores. So based on the information that's been provided by the vendors, like if they process data, if they have certain policies and standards in place, is that a good piece of information that you're storing about them, or is it like bad according to your standards? And yeah, this Daniel particularly, I know would have benefited you because you were really hot on vendor risk management. I mean, you had to be for the industries that you worked in, but I know that
Yes.
someone like you, because you spent so long reviewing your vendor due diligence, you could glance at a form and almost like the matrix, you would be able to see this is bad, this is good, this is bad, and so on. But
Yeah.
this does that for you. You don't have to read a whole due diligence assessment to get the gist of how well the vendor is performing. Gatekeeper calculates it as a literal score out of 100, and also every time they repeat it, you get a chart of their progress over time. So that data that you're capturing, or you might have been capturing it, like Daniel said, you might have been capturing it anyway as part of your standard vendor onboarding and due diligence. Now you can get some better insights from it without having to be an absolute expert, having performed due diligence on thousands of vendors. Gatekeeper, you'll just have to configure the forms, say what scores are good and which are bad, and then Gatekeeper will calculate the overall top level summary there. So
James,
this,
is just
sorry.
quickly, you can we close the poll now, just in
Oh,
case it's
of
taking up?
course.
No, I
Yeah.
know once you're on a roll, you're gonna be completely zoned in. So no, I appreciate that. But it's a really good point. If you've set up your weightings and you're comfortable with the weightings, it probably aligns with your wider procurement, your contract policy.
Yeah.
The score's going to really give you a good guiding point, right? You can just dive into the exceptions as opposed to having to go through all of it in a load of detail.
Exactly. So and this is the scenario where if you are looking at a specific vendor, like I'm looking at Atlassian here, I might want to see their performance over time, but they're a 90 out of 100. I'm sort of fine with that. But if you were in the mindset of, I want to see how my vendors are doing on average or like across my vendor base, not only can you see it within a particular vendor record, but I'm in the whole vendor repository here. I have a view called, this one's just called compliance, but what I've got here is not just the values that have been entered by either internal or external users whilst performing these vendor due diligence assessments. I actually have that top level score, so I can see how well my vendors adhere to like my policies. Like, are they underperforming, overperforming? Are my standards, appropriate there? So what you would want is that end goal of having this data in Gatekeeper so you can track an individual vendor over time, but also so that if you were to look at your vendor database, you'd be able to easily able to see en masse, are my vendors like meeting a certain standard that I need for our own internal policies, or for my personal company's industry standards, like are we actually maintaining IT policy standards and so on. So that's what you'd want in your repository, that when you go here, you can check these values and they are all populated and they're all reliable and up to date. And also that they're being logged over time, so that every time you perform a repeat assessment, if you want to, you can jump into the history of a particular vendor and see when how it's been performing each time you reassess them. So anything else I need to cover there, Daniel, do you think, before we move on to the
I
config?
think
I would want to spoil the later sections where we configure the workflow side and show it in a live environment like this. But I think what I'd rather do is actually show building it into a workflow later, so we can talk about the automations that are possible on the config side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen a question coming in for Darren. I was just reading that. Sorry, James, not to look looking away into the distance. And Darren also asked a really good question in advance of this webinar. We do plan on covering that, Darren, for you, and actually show you all the weightings and how it's all sort of aggregated and what happens if certain scores aren't needed and how it changes for you. So James is going to get to that at some point in the session for you.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually excited for that bit because we've got like an interesting use case to show specifically Darren, because I think he asked a question in the sign up form as well.
That's right.
Around weightings and calculations. Yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. Yeah, happy for you to jump into the config, James. We're 20 minutes in. We've got about half an hour for config for you before we do any like sort of Q&A.
Oceans of time.
Yeah.
Okay,
perfect.
Cool. So we'll get started with the basics then. Here's a new environment where I don't have any SmartForms. The environment's called Gatekeeper SmartForms, rather confusingly, but this is one where I'm ready to get started using them. And I think it was last week, the week before, we actually enabled this new tab for every single Gatekeeper tenant. So any of you, if you have access to this menu, the settings configuration menu, should be able to go to custom data and open up a SmartForms tab and get started, because it should be enabled for your environment. If it isn't, obviously you can reach out to your CSM or contact our support or success teams and they'll get that switched on. But you'll be able to go to custom data, SmartForms, and this is where you can set them up. And in fact, I'm going to build, Daniel, you shared with me an example ESG assessment earlier. I chopped up and cut out a load of the questions because I don't want this webinar to be me. And in fact, I'm going to cut out one
an
more.
ESG lesson. No,
yeah,
it's fine.
So I'm going to turn this Excel set of cells into a SmartForm in Gatekeeper. So the first step I'm going to take is, and you can do it here or here, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to hit add SmartForm and I'll call it ESG. And then you want to decide, is this SmartForm scoring data against contracts or vendor records? So this is ESG is obviously for vendors. You can also make additional decisions here.
Just to be super clear on that, that's where it'll eventually be housed, the data, right? Either on the vendor record, so allocated to vendor means on the left-hand side, when you click on vendor, go into your vendor record, you'll have a dedicated tab with SmartForms there, or just the one SmartForm, depending on what you've got, or vice versa. If it's contract, that's where it is. Sorry, I'm just going to be I'm just going to jump in and
that's fine.
A stickler for the detail there. Awesome.
That's fine.
I'll let you go on.
I'm going to keep this one fairly basic. So there are some decisions you can make here, like should all vendors have ESG assessments, or maybe only like my tier 1 vendors or something like that. I'm just going to assume it's all for now. You can also add some extra details, like a description of the SmartForm for other users that see it in future. You can also set the RAG threshold. So RAG, for those of you that don't know the term, means red, amber, green. And so the scenario here is if a score for a vendor is less than 55, that'll be red, which is bad. If it's above 55, it'll be amber. And if it's above 75, that'll be green, which is good. So you can change these in future as well. So if you set these RAG thresholds and maybe all of your vendors are red, you might want to just change the RAG thresholds. So more
get new vendors.
Or get new vendors or change your standards that you're working to. But I can configure these later. But the standard that we put in is less than 55 is bad, above 75 is good. And this is like the point I mentioned a second ago, Daniel. This is where you can actually configure as well. Where will Gatekeeper let data be edited? And if it is the case that you're fully bought in on workflows and you only want workflows to be the place that they can be changed, you could untick these two to say APIs and manual edits in the repository. I don't want to let them happen, but there's no real harm in leaving these enabled because, if you have the right user permission set up, no one will be using these unless you preordained that they should be allowed to do that. But once I hit save now,
quickly. No, it's okay. You're more,
okay.
No, you haven't done anything bad there. So in terms of the RAG threshold, the score that we're referring to is that final score that you will see on the vendor record. So if someone in that instance had a score of 54 based on all of the weightings and the overall categories that we're going to build in a moment, they would have a red score, or that's how it would look on screen for you there. And it's a really good visual indicator to say, this is really bad.
Yeah. For now, that's the case. In fact, when in future iterations, and I'm aware we're going to get to future updates to SmartForms at the end, but in future iterations, there will be group by group breakdown. And I'll actually explain what that means in a second when we get configuring this. But if you are viewing a SmartForm, you'll be able to see this section is green, this one is red, this one is amber, and so on. But yeah, you're right, Daniel. You will also get the top level rolled up. How well is the whole score? How well is the whole SmartForm scored? Okay, but now I've got my SmartForm called ESG. I don't have any groups or data in it yet, though. So what I need to add now is my first group, and this one's going to be called Environment and Sustainability. And once I have my group, so you might want to think of this as like a section because you might have multiple sections that make up your whole ESG assessment. I can start adding my custom fields. So the first one I'm going to add is a simple yes, no. Do you have an environmental policy in place? Yes, no. And then hit
James,
save.
just quickly, whilst we're there on the response types, SmartForms
the field, so
is limited to the types that it works for. You happy just to quickly give a brief overview on that as we're going through?
So because you need to be able to predefine how well something will score, the types that can be scored are fairly fixed. So you can only apply a scoring to a percentage field. So if someone puts in a value between 0 and 100, a yes, no and a fixed drop down, because these are ones where you can very easily say what score is this based on the input that the users put in. So for instance, I'm about to put in, an attached file. So based on that initial question that someone asked, do you have an environmental policy in place? If the user says yes, we want them to attach it. However, you can't score an attachment because it's a document, but you can score the yes, no that comes before it. So when I go to configuring the scores in a second, you'll see that I don't have an option to assign what happens if a user attaches a document here. So that's my first group, environment and sustainability. And I'm just going to quickly do the remaining two. So I'm going to add a second one called social.
And James, I was just thinking, if you do upload a dedicated file that's around a policy and you want a separate form for that dedicated policy review, like there's loads of options here that you can use these Gatekeeper workflows and forms to really build up as much or as little as you want. We're doing quite a basic use case here just to get the examples, but once you get going with this and you're comfortable using it, and I would encourage as many of you as possible to start doing what James is doing here, which is play around with the config, learn it. It's actually nowhere near as complicated as you first think. I used to have to set up loads of these, and I haven't done it for years now, and I can still just pick it up like a bicycle. So definitely have a look at all of that. Yeah, James, over to you.
Cool. So thanks for confirming some of the details whilst I clicked around and typed like crazy. Okay, so now we have our smart form with the fields that we want to ask about are basically around policies, and then asking the users to attach their policies, which is a fairly simple use case. But like I said, I gutted the form that you sent me earlier. But now we have what we want users to fill in. What we can now configure is how will Gatekeeper score the answers that users put in there. So now I'm going to hit configure weights, and this is going to take me through to a screen where we see those same fields. So if I expand these sections, these are just those same fields I entered. But what we can do now is we can say which ones we want to be scored in there. So I'm going to configure, and this is going to be a really simple example. I'll show you a bit more of a sophisticated one in a second. But I'm going to say all of these sections, so environment and sustainability, should have scored fields within it. And now that I've scored the section, I can say that the field within it, this yes, no, should be scored. And once you select a field should be scored, what you then do is very simply expand that field and you choose what the scores should be. And it's worth noting, because I've used yes, no's, which are like the simplest type of drop down, Gatekeeper just assumes that yes is very, very good and no is very, very bad. And I'm actually going to leave it like this because the way I've worded these questions is that's correct. So do you have an environmental policy in place? If the user says yes, they get 100% score. If they say no, they get a 0. But you can reconfigure these here if you want. And what we then do is go through the remaining ones and hit scored again, score this field. And as you'll see in here, it's done the same because it's a yes, no, and same in here. I'm going to say this is a scored section, and this field is also a scored field, but then we'll see again, the values of these these responses are the same. One thing that we want to do now is decide how much each of these sections is worth to the total score. So this is what we had that question on around how groupings work. So there is actually a really handy button here to say distribute group weights equally. So what that would mean is if we want environment, sustainability, social, and governance standards to all be worth the same value towards the top level score, we could make them, they'd have to be 33.33 recurring, but we could hit distribute rates equally and it would basically do that. And actually I'd have to change 1 to 3, 4 just to round it off to 100. You'll see Gatekeeper notes how well you've distributed, like if you've completed your distributions yet. But if some are more important than others, so for us, environment might be most important, you could make that 50. And I might think social is only worth 20, and then the remainder here has to be worth 30. So you can actually make it so that the amount that they roll up to the top level score is differentiated based on how important they are to you and your standards. And how this will work is basically this percentage will be multiplied by the values of all the fields within to give, and then added to the top level score. So for instance, I've got 100% here. If the user puts yes, and this is 100%, but that's 50% of the top level score, that will contribute 50 out of 100 to the total scores form. One thing I need to do within each of these forms, which I'd bypass. So not only do you have to score the groups, how much are they worth to the total score, you have to score the fields. And it could be the same. Like if I had lots of different questions within this particular form section, I only have one. But if I had lots of them, they might all be worth the same, or they might be worth different depending on how important they are. And I could say distribute the weights equally. In this case, distributing them equally just gives 100 to it because it's the only question. But it could be one of those where I do 50-50, I do, thirds each, or I make it skewed depending on how I think things are relevant. So I'm going to distribute the weights equally to all of these because they're all only one question, so they all need to be 100%. And that's basically it. So now when I hit save, and just make sure I double save, I have all of the scores distributed within each of those groups, all of the fields distributed, and all of those fields, the yes, no's have scores. That's a smart form configured. That's a really simple way of building one from scratch. Obviously, I made this the simplest of the simple forms. It just had some yes, no's in it, but that's simply how you do it if you're building from scratch. However, one thing I want to show is building a smart form from existing data. But before I jump into that, Daniel, is there anything I've missed on the config side that you think I need to cover?
No, I think we'll get there.
Okay.
Yeah, right. Like I think ultimately we've got layers, right? We've got the question layer and how they all ladder up to an overall score out of 100, and then how that overall category then ladders up to that top level score. And just on the point of yes nos, if you can get your vendors and third parties to answer yes no questions, it makes your data capture so much easier. If you can, it's always one thing that is often overlooked is like how easy is it for your vendors to actually work with you. If you've got a huge due diligence form with loads of open fields, and I've seen those and I've had to push back against those, sometimes very unsuccessfully, they make your vendors' lives hell. And there's always that piece to consider. But yeah, no, James, that was a good overview there for sure.
So that was, and yeah, you're right. The reason that I used yes nos there, and in fact, we had a webinar I think last year where we talked about building workflow forms, and the best way to do it is making sure that they're easy for users to interact with. Making so many fields open format is not only laborious to fill out, it's also like really open to interpretation. Like some people might not know how much detail do they go into, are they giving it the right answers, things like that. But yeah, so what I'm going to do now though is go through a scenario that I think a lot of people on this webinar might have, which is they aren't building something completely from scratch like this ESG one I've got. They might have existing sets of data that they might have already built into their workflows, they might have already populated, they might be already working from, but they just want that scoring applied. They want the benefits of the insights that SmartForms provides without having to start from scratch like I just did. And you can do that. So what I'm going to do is in this environment, I'm going to add a smart form called InfoSec, and it's also going to be a vendor smart form. So InfoSec, attribute that to my vendors. And rather than once I'm in this form, doing the same thing, adding my groups, adding my fields, adding the drop downs, all of that sort of stuff, I'm just going to go back over to my custom data, which is where I've already been working from, and find some existing sections that I just push into that smart form. Simple as. So I've got, you can see here, there's a few sections to do with InfoSec. There's a physical security one that I haven't done anything with, but what I'm going to do is simply hit move and then choose that new smart form I just created, InfoSec, and hit save. And I've done that for the date section, and I'll call out why that's important later. But I'll move this one. I'll move this one. InfoSec. I'll move this one. I'm wondering if I should skip any of these because watching me click around is probably not thrilling, but I'll move all of them.
No, it's a good point, James. So if you've done a lot of the work around like making these custom groups, like just convert them to smart forms. You don't have to start again. And the only thing you need to reconsider is like, actually, how are we going to score these? How does it all ladder up? And typically, I know many of you will have procurement policies, vendor management policies, contract policies, legal policies, probably policies about just about everything, depending on like the type of industry and stuff you're working in. And you may need to make some changes in that, or start there and then apply it within Gatekeeper. Just keep that in mind for your effectively your processes internally. But yeah, it's so easy to do this, right? Like straight away, I did this for a DORA questionnaire that I had built out, and super easy experience. So yeah, good to see that.
Yeah. But yeah, like if you already have that data, if you've already been working to those requirements, like DORA, things like that, why not just move them over to a scored section? Because you're only just going to get a bit more insight from the data you're already collecting. So I've moved all those sections over, and now because I've already configured all the fields within them as well, here are my fields like around pen testing, MFA access, service time monitoring, and so on. I can do the same thing as before when I'd built my fields and sections. I can hit configure weights, and that will take me into this screen here where I can start deciding which of these groups should contribute to the SmartForm score and which shouldn't. And as an FYI, the reason I wanted to call out these dates is there were some date fields. Let me just jump back a smidge. There were some date fields in my infosec set of custom groups called last review date and next review date. And obviously, and there's also an infosec status, like whether it's been reviewed or whether a review is required and so on, just status flags to let people know like what's going on with this vendor. And obviously, these are very useful to have as custom fields for automation and just for FYIs for people looking at the vendor records, but they shouldn't really count towards the score. So when I go into configure weights here, this is definitely a section I'm just going to leave as not scored. And I'm just going to say for all these other sections, like around policies, security, incidents and reporting, and cybersecurity, obviously these ones do. And I'm going to assume that they're all worth the same. So I'm just going to distribute weights equally. So they're all worth 25% of the total score. I might need to save whilst I'm going, so I'm not overloading the amount of config that I'm changing here. So now I'm in that section. I have a few different fields. These aren't all yes, no's. Some of these are a bit more complex. So once I make these fields scored and expand them, you'll see there are different actual answers here. So I'm going to say all of these answers are still scoreable, and I'm going to give them different scores based on how well I think they are valued. So I'm going to say 150 and then 50 and then 0 for the bottom one. I'm just like winging these answers here. I'm going to say
No, but it's a good point, James, right? Like when you've got multiple options, you don't have to necessarily do things completely different, right? So you've got 250s there, and that's absolutely fine. You may value something just as much. You may want to massively score one of these responses and give that the 100. There's so many different options with what you can do based on what you're asking. We're asking questions here that you've used so far. InfoSec as an example. We've used ESG as an example. Two of these, two categories that are on people's minds every single day. We're seeing cyber hacks happen nonstop at the moment. We're seeing more and more of a need to do ESG and more of a push from shareholders, regulators, things like that. So I think these are really good examples to pick out, and just to show you that you can start trying to tie a more objective score on it, as opposed to just you spoke at the start just there around the infosec dates piece, and when you've last reviewed it, this just gives you another layer of, I would almost say, credibility and competency around your review process. I think as we look at our third parties, our supply chains, our contracts with more and more scrutiny, and regulators do the same, shareholders do the same, this is super helpful. So yeah, I think it's a good thing to be showing, really good subject matter to base it on as well.
Cool. So I'm done with this, and yeah, I was just going to follow up and sort of go along those lines of what you were saying, that some things might be worth more than others, like the responses you give, and it's the same with like weightings of questions. So in this cybersecurity standards, we've got some fairly well-known standards like ISO 27001 and SOC audits, but then there's other ones that you might have that are maybe nice to have that should still be scored, but might be worth less of the overall SmartForm rolled up score there. But now that I've assigned scores to all the fields that I wanted to score and the appropriate values that are given based on what's been put in, I can hit save, and that's done. And what's interesting, let me go to my vendor repository, because I said this might be a scenario that some of those on this webinar are in, where you've already got lots of custom data, where you've already got values in it. What you would have is, and let me just double check, I might not have to re-trigger some stuff, SmartForms in a sec. Yeah, so what you would have is, as soon as you configure that SmartForm, moving that data in, you can see this information provided for Atlassian. Well, the date is actually showing us today because I've just configured it, but the values that were already in here, so I'd already completed some infosec review for Atlassian. Now that I've converted it to a SmartForm, I've instantly got a score. So 82.92. So Atlassian have got a very good score. And the same goes for my vendor repository. In this view I've got here called InfoSec Review, where I've got all those fields that make up the smart form. Previously they didn't, they were just custom data. What I can add to that now is, now that I've created a smart form for it, you'll see in your repository view there's a new section called summary scores. And I can say, not only do I want to have all these questions, I want to put the InfoSec score right at the front of those. And when I hit save, you'll see here are all the scores for all these vendors that have already been completing these assessments for me, or have already completed them, sorry, in the past. So I could just instantly get value from the information that already done all the work on. I've already collected it. I just needed to tell Gatekeeper how to score the answers that are in there. So just a really cool way that you can just convert existing data to a smart form so that you get that score created instantly.
Yeah, it's a really good snapshot, right? Like that 37.5 completely fictitious to BT, of course. I'm sure that they'd be really good, having worked with them in the past. But
Sorry.
no, it's good to see, like, straight away, like, where does our attention need to turn to? And that can get really difficult when you're just looking at form data, where you've got lots of responses. You kind of get overwhelmed with the data, and that's something that this kind of just cuts through all that noise. You can just really prioritize the ones that you want to focus on. So super useful. James, I'm just gonna take the moment, just give you a 2-second break and just answer a couple of questions coming in, because I'm conscious that we may not get to a dedicated Q&A. So if anyone has questions, please let us know. We'll do our best to answer them whilst we melt here somewhat more as well. Darren asked a really good question about the roadmap, multi-select drop-downs for scoring. Can we do anything around that? It's currently not on our roadmap, Darren, but that doesn't mean it won't get there. So just by you engaging here, it gives us something more to think about. And the more people that start thinking about that, wanting it, we take that all into account. So we have something called the ideas forum. James, can you just hover up onto the help center?
Yeah.
Just there. The ideas forum is where we can log various different requests. James, maybe after this session, we can add that to the ideas forum as well.
Yeah.
So just as a bit of context, SmartForms, the way we release product features is typically version 1, and then we constantly iterate, and SmartForms is one that absolutely we are dedicated to. We're going to be doing loads of cool stuff. James already alluded to talking about some of that. So we will absolutely take that into account. I've already sent it over to the product owner about that, and he's up for already talking about it internally. So that's just there quickly for you, Darren. Liz, we have an entire dedicated knowledge base article. James will share this as part of the recording.
Yeah.
Equally, you can access it just there as well. I think, yeah, perfect, James. Appreciate that. We've got an entire guide here. And if you do need help with this, I appreciate, like, you may be able to do this yourself, but we know how valuable your time is, how many constraints you have. Please reach out to your customer service manager, your account executive, the people that manage that relationship with you. They can absolutely help you get started with this. And James alluded to the tenant health check, maybe a really good precursor to getting that done. Make sure your workflows are optimized in the first place, and then add in SmartForms, because SmartForms really is adding a level of maturity, I would say. And then just there was a question came in from Amajit Verdi, asking about SmartForms. Can we just apply it to certain types or specific vendors? And Amajit, it may be worthwhile that James and I follow up with you maybe tomorrow after this session. My initial thoughts are maybe you're actually kind of referring to a need that we already satisfy with our scorecards module, and that works slightly differently to SmartForms, in that you can target your internal users and review specific vendors. It may not be that, though. It's really hard to answer these questions live and figure that out. And James, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that with regards to SmartForms, whilst I just check a couple of other questions.
There is a lot. Yeah, I don't know. He might have been talking about whether you restrict the smart form being allocated to specific sets of
your tier
vendors.
ones, like you said.
That does depend on how you're using the vendor type field, though, because if you're segmenting it by maybe industry or service type that they provide, versus, criticality, like tier one versus your tier three
Yeah,
and your standard commodity vendors, then that
it can
might
skew
not be the
that,
best
right?
way to do it. But that could be a way
Yeah.
to do it. But also you could still have the smart form be available in every vendor record, but then choose which ones go through a particular workflow process. And
Yeah,
you
we can
could
trigger
manage it
that
on the
on.
process side. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, trigger that on with a specific data point, a custom data field, things
yeah,
like that. Really good point there,
yep,
James. And actually, just a really good point to raise around like the vendor type that we refer to. The segmentation model typically should be based on criticality. That's kind of the best practice way to use that field within Gatekeeper.
yeah.
Awesome. All right, I am just quickly checking here. We have had a question about Microsoft OneDrive come in and managing contracts. I'm just going to slightly pause answering that question because we've got a lot coming out real soon around all of the contracts with Google, Microsoft, loads of really cool stuff with some AI functionality there as well. And we're actually going to do a dedicated webinar just on that to really help you. James, just one interesting question that came in. I think it's probably a good point here. If you make changes to your smart form year over year, how does that affect the historical scoring?
Oh yeah, there is a. I think that's included in the FAQ on the smart form guide, because one thing that will happen is if you do go back into a smart form later and add new fields and then reconfigure the fields that you've got in there and the weights and so on, there'll be a big button here that says like apply like retroactive changes and so on. So, but there is specific terminology in the smart forms guide that confirms how that works and how it changes previous previous snapshots and so on, or whether it does or doesn't. But yeah, it'd be a bit complicated for me to start editing around to show it live. But I'll check that it's in the SmartForms guide, but I'll make sure that we do share that at the end of this webinar with everyone.
Amazing, James. I think that is everything that I'm seeing here. If you've got any more questions, please let us know. We've got 12 minutes left, James.
Okay. I really want
And
to talk about the workflow side though. So
yeah, no,
so,
please do. We may not get to the contract use case, but if we don't
oh
get through
no.
to
Yeah.
anything, what we will do is we'll record some dedicated videos and send them out as part of this. Maybe next
Yeah.
week we'll do a follow up for you.
Sure. Okay. So one thing to note is that that smart form that I created from existing data in my vendor onboarding workflow here, where I'm just going to take you under the hood and show you all the sections of the form. So I've got like the request form, the vendor core details. I already had all of my infosec stuff in there already, and like I said, this might be the case for a lot of you on this webinar, that you already have custom groups like this, like your infosec standards, your infosec policies, all those sections already in a workflow that are already being filled out by internal or external users. If you have that, you do not need to do anything because the smart form can be filled out just as it has been before. The only difference now is when you have the data that's entered on a workflow pushed back to the repository, it will then be scored. Like the scores will be calculated based on what you set. However, you might also be in the scenario that you've just built a new ESG smart form, for instance, and you can add that in, and I'll just show you how by saying add section. My ESG one was a vendor smart form, so I just choose vendor as like the host predefined record. And rather than choosing a group, smart forms are found under custom tabs because they're very similar in terms of database terms. So I want to choose my ESG section, hit save, and Gatekeeper is going to add those 3 ESG sections we saw me build earlier. And one thing to note is that this is where you can, and I'm not going to get too into the weeds with configuring this workflow, this is where you set who should be able to edit these or who should be able to see them at different phases. So this ESG assessment, I'm going to assume that it shouldn't really be updated by the user requesting a vendor. It should be updated over here by the vendor themselves when they're completing their onboarding form. So what I can do with my ESG sections is on this form down here, set these all to be editable by that vendor, and I'm going to make them mandatory as well. Actually, no, I'm not, because I'm going to have to fill this in. You can make them mandatory if you want to be. If
They
you
made it
want to have
mandatory
that.
for the demo.
No, not for this demo, but if you want to be more controlling of what your vendors have to actually fill out before they're able to submit their onboarding form, you can decide which of these elements are mandatory. And what you can also do is leveraging our auto actions. So our auto actions, for just as for those of you that don't know, what you can configure actions to do in Gatekeeper is take stuff that's happening on the workflow, like forms being filled in, and affect the values outside of it, i.e. the vendor record in your central source of truth in your vendor repository. So what we have configured on this onboarded done phase for tier 1 vendors is when the card lands there, so when the vendor has completed all the steps of this workflow, this action is going to fire and it's going to take all the values in the form and push them back to that vendor record. And what I want to make sure is by ticking these boxes, I'm telling Gatekeeper, whatever the vendor user puts in here, also send that back to the repository so people can see it in the vendor record. And that's, again, all you have to really do. The smart form is now in the workflow. And in fact, I have a vendor, new IT vendor over here that will have those are those smart form sections they can fill in. I'm going to give this one, I can't remember the weightings I gave, but I'm going to give it yeses and nos. And here's my infosec one that's going to load itself up dynamically because the vendor has said they process our data. I'm going to answer a couple of these, but for speed, I'm not going to answer everything. Answer a few questions on behalf of the vendor, and then submit those responses. One thing to note is there's an element of the element of control that you have over the SmartForm score is that the score won't be committed to your repository until you finish, or until one of those auto actions fires and commits that score. So for instance, if I open up this vendor, new IT vendor, in my repository and go to SmartForms and open up infosec, it shows 0 currently because there's no data in there. But once this onboarding completes, so I'm just going to hit approve here real quick. Once this onboarding completes and it moves to that done phase, if I refresh here now, it's gone up. Like I only filled out some of the answers, so a lot of it didn't get good scores, but the score is logged because the workflow is now completed, and it turns out it's a red. So I probably should have filled out a bit more to make that a nice result, but that's one of those things that's happened. And finally, this is just one of those best practice things around structuring reviews like this. So at the start, when I showed the end goal, where you had performance over time, when we showed Atlassian, where they'd been completing I think it was InfoSec, a reassessment at set periods. One thing you would want to do is make sure that this new IT vendor, which could be an Atlassian for you, it could be a Gatekeeper or something like that, is also required to complete repeat assessments. So one thing you'll spot at the top of this smart form is this is the section that wasn't scored, but it's very useful information. It's telling me the last review date, which is automatically populated based on today's date. And it's telling me the next review date is in 3 months' time. So because this is a tier 1 vendor, Gatekeeper has calculated it should be assessed on a quarterly basis. But if let's say if this was actually just a standard vendor, and I'm gonna do something like uncouth, I'm going to drag this over to another phase
Not
of the
best
workflow
practice.
manually. No, you should be configuring Gatekeeper to put cards where they need to go automatically.
For the interest of the demonstration.
Yeah, for the interest of the demo, I'm going to drag it over to what a normal vendor would end up with, and it should be the case that if I refresh this now, it's saying this next review isn't going to happen until 2025 in a year's time. So you can set up these dates to calculate based on different types of vendors going through your processes and things like that. But the ideal scenario is that you get them completed when you set up the vendor, because obviously you want to perform these initial due diligence assessments. And I think Richard mentioned this on one of our webinars, didn't he, Daniel, that you don't want to be in that scenario where the only time you performed a risk assessment is when you start the relationship. You want it to be a continuous and reliable. Yeah, you want it to be continuous and reliable, so that you aren't 3 years down the line and they've been breached because you didn't actually check about any of their policies changing over time. So these sorts of dates can be automatically set by the system so that the reviews themselves start automatically. And that's what takes me on to this next piece, that I have over here an annual InfoSec or annual or quarterly InfoSec due diligence workflow that is a triggered one. So it's not the vendor onboarding one we just saw. It's a workflow where I've set up a rule that says when the next review date for a vendor is 7 days in the future, automatically start that review so the vendor can provide that update. And that's what, in the original end goal scenario of Atlassian, that's the scenario that you want to have in place so that you have a good timeline, that you don't have to be remembering, oh, I haven't checked Atlassian's risk score in a while. You just want the dates to start the processes like this. They can submit their reassessment form. That logs a new SmartForm score, and then in 3 months, rinse and repeat. And it's not something that you really even have to worry about, depending on, you know, how much you want input on the process. You might even want to just be something completely automated that goes to the vendor, they submit it, and then it's done.
Yeah, no, James, it's a good point for sure, and it will start to populate on that historical data piece as well. It lets you focus on potential vendors that maybe were underperforming somewhat as well. So yeah, really good points there. James, I'm just going to give you a quick time check because we've got 4 minutes. We were probably wildly optimistic again with scored forms. I don't think we're going to get to the contract use case. I appreciate there's people on here that probably want to see the contract use case, but we will get you something. We'll get a dedicated video out to you so you can watch that. We're more than happy to jump on calls with you, kind of go through that one by one as well, and just show that off to you. But James, what else would you like to cover in the last few minutes here, if anything?
So should we cover upcoming features to SmartForms? Because some people on this webinar might be using them or might already be planning how they're going to use them and might be interested in what's coming out in future. And we even had a question around multi-pick drop-down fields coming out in future, which is not on the roadmap yet, but definitely a good question. Upcoming updates. Let me quickly rifle through them then. So the first one is just a nice visibility update. So one thing, if I open up this vendor we just did, one thing on workflows is you will be able to see in the card of a vendor or a contract that has a smart form, there'll be a tab called SmartForms. So you'll be able to view the current scores for that particular record, the new IT vendor in this case, without having to go to the vendor record and then navigate it to the SmartForms tab and so on. You'll just see it. And that's useful not just for the actual process itself that you're looking at, but if I'm raising a new contract with this new IT vendor, it might be very useful to be aware that they've got a very poor information security score. So I might have to build in extra clauses and penalties into my contract, extra safeguards and so on. But the update that we're going to have to this is not only will we show the current score, so this score is what's been pushed to that repository via those actions, but if you're performing that reassessment, what we'll have in this tab is the score that's in the repository, but like alongside any changes that might have been made on the current workflow. So let's assume this is a workflow that's like reassessing the vendor for information security. If they've put in new responses and maybe their score's gone up, you'll see a previous and you'll see an in progress. I always forget the names of them. One of them is definitely called in progress, and the other one is called like actual. So you'll be able to
give me the real comparison.
Time. Yeah, so one of them will be real time, like what's happening on the workflow, but what is the score based on the answers that have been provided during this form, and one of them is what's currently the score that's in the repository that everyone can see on the vendor record. To expand on that, what we'll also be able to see, and Daniel, you sort of made a point about this when we talked about RAG statuses. Not only will you see that top level score, so I can see here InfoSec is 45.83, you'll be able to see in the workflow card that 45.83 has come from 12.5 from the policies, 8.33 from network security, 12.5 from here. You'll be able to see the breakdown of not just what's the average score of the whole form, how is each individual section performing. So you'll get a more granular view of what is this vendor or contract good for and what's poor and what needs improvement. Yeah, they're the two easy ones to get your heads around. The other one, which I think is really cool and is probably my favorite for like for the terms of automations, is, and this is a very advanced one, so it might only be some people on the webinar that sort of grasp it, is you'll be able to use the scores as conditional logic within workflows. And if any of you were on the Market IQ webinar that Daniel, I, and Richard did last year, we had a really cool example of this. We had a vendor onboarding workflow that towards the end of the process had an additional like financial risk assessment, but based on Market IQ being a very good score or very bad score, sometimes the cards would just skip it. So basically, if a vendor was a very well-scoring financial health, it didn't need the additional risk assessment. It was basically pre-approved. You'd be able to build in the same thing to your workflows if the vendor scores in their forms are also very good. So you'd be able to do things like if a vendor answers really good questions, answers their questions really well, you could have an element of just skipping a bunch of steps in the process because they've met all of your standards. You don't need extra insights from loads of different teams and departments. You can just use that logic to make your process a lot more efficient. But they're the things I'm really excited about that are coming out for SmartForms. That said, it's still very useful as is, and it's one of those things that, like you mentioned, Daniel, we're iterating the features that we add to it. So there's no reason you shouldn't, if you have objectives and goals for that, start building out your SmartForms now, so that you can be gathering that data, embedding it in your workflows and setting up the processes so you're getting those snapshots, so that when these improvements and new feature iterations come out over time, you're instantly ready to start using them, either on your own or with the help of someone from our professional services team. But yeah,
Amazing.
I do have a poll to launch, Daniel. So let me launch
No,
that,
no, all
and
good.
I'll
Please
pass
launch
back
the.
to you to wrap up if there's anything else
No,
to discuss.
I do appreciate that. We do have a question from Joanne Darish. Joel, we're going to get back to you after the session, more specific on this question, because it may take a little bit more time. And I'm conscious that we are at time, but really appreciate it, especially as you've asked questions for like the last 3 webinars. I really appreciate that engagement. That is amazing. Darren, really appreciate all the questions around this as well. Super helpful to everyone, and just really appreciate all the questions that we've had in. James, we've got no more questions. We didn't get to cover our contract element. We will get, like I said, we'll get something on that. It's effectively the same, just a slight different use case. We appreciate not everyone is vendor focused when it comes to Gatekeeper. Just as one little thing, try and combine as much as possible vendor and contract management when you're using Gatekeeper within your business. Makes it so much easier to use. Really appreciate everyone's time and attention here. If we didn't answer anything, or you still have questions, please just reach out to her. You can reach out to James and I direct, super easy to get a hold of. LinkedIn, email, super easy. We'll get some more material out to you. James, was there anything else you wanted to add there, just to sign off?
No, I think I agree with your point that, yeah, of the bits we missed and of the questions that people asked that we didn't get time to cover, yeah, we'll follow up with either specific little mini videos, because they're definitely use cases that other people will be interested in, or we'll make sure it's included in the follow-up comms, because yeah, there's a lot of good questions that unfortunately we just ran out of time and we didn't get to.
No worries. Awesome. Appreciate everyone's attention here, and yeah, we'll catch you in maybe hopefully in like 3-4 weeks. I think we're going to do another like a big one on another product area, and we'll have our product release session for August, probably in the first week of July, just given some leave. So please make sure you come along to the next 2 that are coming up, and yeah, really help you with your understanding of Gatekeeper and getting the most out of it. But yeah, catch you all soon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.